Hello, everyone. Welcome to Touch Tank Tuesday. Again, we are ready for another session of Touch Tank Tuesday where we will talk about another cool organism that lives in our touch tanks. My name is Olivia, and I'm the educator here at the Deep Bay Marine Field Station. We are an education and research facility that is part of Vancouver Island University. So, good afternoon. Welcome. Our facility focuses on shellfish aquaculture, and really the research that goes into all of that. Hi. Welcome, Becky. And the girls, I assume. And so we do a lot of research on our local marine environment here in Deep Bay. So we're located on Vancouver Island for those who are coming from a bit more of a distance. Hi, Julie, welcome. And today you might be able to notice we are looking at a more sessile, relaxed species. We are going to be talking about seaweed. So let me just remove this so it's not here the entire time. So in one of our previous sessions, hopefully you've seen, we talked about algae, but we talked about microalgae. So seaweed is a type of algae. It kind of goes into that big group of algae, but they're called macroalgae. Very good. It's good to hear. So they're called, hi Lisa, welcome. So they are referred to as macroalgae, and what that means is they have more than one cell. So if you thought about the microalgae we talked about before, it had one cell, but now we're looking at algae that has more than one cell. And these kind of look like plants. The species that we're going to talk about today is the Turkish washcloth. And unfortunately, I had picked up this Turkish washcloth seaweed from the beach maybe a month ago during low tide. And so I remembered that I had it and I created this session on it. But when I went to our touch tanks, I realized that someone has been eating our seaweed. So you can see there are all of these little chew marks. So our touch tank critters are very much so enjoying having this seaweed in the touch tank. Today's session will be a little bit shorter than usual. We have a busy day here at the station, and I've just finished having a really big class of preschool students in at the station, where we did a really cool art project called Gyotaku. So this is Gyotaku, and it's basically a Japanese art where you take fish. We have rubber fish, and you print them onto either paper, or in this case, we did t-shirts. So we have different fish prints on t-shirts. So we had a whole class doing that today. And Gyotaku fish painting is really cool because many years ago in Japan, people didn't have the ability to take pictures, obviously, of fish. So what they would do is they'd take ink, they would put it on actual fish, the fishermen that caught them. Yeah, it's so cool. They would take it, they would put ink on actual dead fish. They would take that and press it onto rice paper. And this way they'd be able to see all the different fish that they caught from out in the ocean. They would take those fish, and maybe in the future, people would be able to see what fish they caught. So it's a really cool way of being able to record their fish catch. Nowadays, we can record it on paper and we can record it by taking pictures, but this was a really cool way for them to be able to record what fish they were bringing in. Oh, hi, James, welcome. Oh, hi, Barbara, welcome. Okay, so that's really cool, and that's why we had people in at the station today. Oh, you're welcome. Hopefully you'll check in later. And so that is a really cool activity we had going on today. So I have a huge setup for another class that's coming in tomorrow. So we are quite excited to have our classes in. But today we'll be talking about seaweed and really everything about this specific seaweed, the Turkish washcloth. And sorry, there's a little bit of noise in the background here. So we'll talk a bit about seaweed, then we'll talk about this species. And if you have any questions at all, thank you. If you have any questions at all, please comment and I will try to answer them as best as I can. If I can't answer them, I'll try and come back later and answer them in the comment section. Okay, so let's get started. So what is seaweed? Well, we started talking about it. Seaweed is basically any organism that has more than one cell, so not that microalgae that had one cell, so it has more than one cell, and it creates its food using photosynthesis. So it's multicellular, it uses photosynthesis to survive, and well, it lives out in the ocean here, or it lives in an aquatic, so a water environment. So the species that we're going to look at today is marine. So we're looking at seaweed that grows in marine environments, so in the ocean. And so that's really the basics for what we call seaweed. So seaweed is one, we can say seaweeds multiple, and it's hard to get the difference in there when we're talking and making sure that we're saying it correctly. So different seaweeds. And there are many different seaweeds that are here in the Pacific Northwest. So usually I use a species guide for the invertebrates that we have at the station, but I have to use my own book, so an entire book, to decide what species of seaweed this is, rather than just using the guide that we had that had a variety of different types of critters. So this whole book talks about all the Pacific seaweeds that there are. And so I use this one to decide what seaweed we have today. So seaweed, it's very informal. So again, it's a group that has all these different organisms. So all of these animals, we could call them, even though they look like plants. And so it has all of these ones, and they're put in this group because of what they do. So they use photosynthesis, and we can remember photosynthesis. We take the sun, carbon dioxide. So remember that gas that we breathe out. So they use that to create, and then water, to create sugars. So they use the sun's energy. We have water, carbon dioxide, and they use it to create sugar. And that's how they actually eat. So they would eat that energy that they created from the sun and the air and the water. So it's really quite an amazing process. So that's just a very basic understanding of photosynthesis. And so that's what they do. And so let's kind of talk about the different parts of seaweed. So I will zoom in here on our seaweed, and hopefully you can still hear me. So I'll be talking and pointing. So this here is our, you can see me again. There we go. This here is our Turkish washcloth. So this seaweed, as you can see, all of these bits here, it has been eaten by something. I think that it was eaten by some of our snails. So we have limpets and whelks, so different types of sea snails, and they must have been very hungry because usually this area is a lot bigger. So I will zoom in and maybe we can focus on some of these chew marks here. Oh no, it does not want to focus. Okay, I'll zoom out a little bit. Sorry, we're having some camera problems. There we go. Okay, it's focusing. So you can see all these chew marks. And so the different parts of the algae. So we'll talk about first the thallus. So the thallus is just the algal body. So that's the structure itself. So that's the thallus. And the lamina is this leaf. So just like we would call leaves on a tree. So this part here, this like big broad area is the lamina. The lamina is attached to a stipe, which I believe is this part here. So it's kind of like branches. Stipes are like branches. This specific species has these tiny little papillae. So that's what they are here. There's these tiny little bumps. And they're basically little holes. And that's where actually reproduction happens with this seaweed. And so that's really where the Turkish washcloth gets its name. So it does not grow anywhere near Turkey, but it's called the Turkish washcloth because of how rough it is. And I think they actually use it in spas. So it's very rough on all of these lamina. So remember that broad leaf-like structure. And so it's very rough, and it can be used as like an exfoliant, like this. And so because it kind of feels like terry cloth, that's why it was called a Turkish washcloth. And this species is actually found, it's native to the Pacific Northwest. So it's native living here. And there are actually multiple different species and different expressions of that species. So all of them look a little bit different. There are 10 that live here in the Pacific Northwest that are called Turkish washcloths. And they're like a red-brown seaweed. And so they can live up to 250 meters. So they can live pretty deep and still be able to produce those sugars with photosynthesis. Because remember, they need that sun. So they can actually live a little bit deeper than most most seaweed. And yeah, these ones are really cool. Now you can see these have all been chewed by someone. And you can see there's also extra algae. So I know I say you can see, but it's kind of hard to see with the light the way it is. But you see all of this sort of like hairs. That's a different type of algae. So that algae is, here we go. So this is a clump of algae. So it's basically, remember those flagellates, those single-celled algae, and the diatoms, those are also single-celled algae organisms. And so they all clump together. So this species will clump together and grow on other things. So what this means is we don't have enough sea urchins in our touch tanks because we're not getting rid of all of that algae that's in the water. Instead, it's settling on different things, kind of like this. Ooh. Georgia wants to clarify that the washcloth is being eaten alive. Yes. Yes, Georgia, you are correct. This washcloth is being eaten alive. And no, I did not think I would ever have to say that. It's funny that this washcloth, there are species that are actually called the Turkish towel. And they look exactly like them, other than they're really big. So the big one is the towel, and this one is the washcloth. So because it's smaller. And this species only gets to be about 15 centimeters. So like these stems that come out, so that stipe that comes out that has the lamina, which is the leaf, that should only be about 15 centimeters when they're fully grown. But the towel is a lot bigger. So it can be fairly big. Yeah, so it is being eaten alive. So those are the different types. Here, so where it attaches to the rock, this species always attaches to the rock. Where it attaches to the rock here is called the holdfast. And that's one unique thing about seaweed versus algae, like single cellular algae, is that seaweed will attach itself to something. So usually it'll attach itself to something. Some of them actually do float in the water column, but together. And so this is called the holdfast, where it's stuck to the rock. And this species really likes the intertidal zone, so it sticks to all the rocks that are there, which is really cool. And so what's really interesting about seaweed is that they reproduce, they don't really reproduce like most plants. What happens is that there are male plants and there are female plants. So I actually don't know if this is male or female, but what happens is the male plant will actually release sperm out into the water column, kind of like what we've seen with broadcast spawning, but they will send that sperm out into the water column. They will land on a female. So if you find a female of this seaweed species, so a female washcloth, yes. And then that sperm has to land in these papillae, so these tiny little holes that are rough all on the surface here. So it lands there, and when it lands, it enters into the seaweed, so into the leaf at the laminae, remember that leaf. And so it will enter in there and actually fertilize an egg. And then they go through mitosis, and afterwards it releases kind of a I forget what it's called, the actual name of it. It's like, it's basically a fertilized sperm that comes out. And then once it comes out, it will settle to the bottom and it will begin to grow and go through photosynthesis and turn into one of these here. So it is really cool the way that it happens, like that. Let me think. I think I've almost covered everything I had prepared for today. So let me just do this and switch us to here. Yeah, it's like the gamete, Michael, but it's actually called something else. It was the first time that I had heard it, and the name of it was quite interesting. And I'll actually just look at it here. So the sperm will drift in the water column until they attach to the female plant. For this one, it'll go into that papillae. The sperm will go through mitosis. So that's like a type of cell division. But it will turn into, okay, here it's called a spermatium. And so that spermatium will fertilize in the pore, so that papillae there. And then the eggs will grow into a tetrasaurophyte. There we go, a tetrasaurophyte, which are more or less like copies of the parents. So it's basically a copy of the parents being sent out into the water. And let me just answer your question here. What kinds are there? Oh, I'm glad you like my shirt. Thank you. So there are many different kinds. Are you thinking kinds of seaweed? There are so many different types, so much so that I had to have an entire book to identify them. For the Turkish washcloth, the Turkish washcloth is really interesting because it has 10 different species just called Turkish washcloths. And so each of those species will grow in a different way. So this one is called a broadleaf. Although someone ate it, this one is called a broadleaf Turkish washcloth. And so that leaf, that lamina, is quite broad, usually if the snails did not eat them. Yeah, Lisa, it was one of those really cool things when learning about seaweed and how they're algae and they're not plants. They actually do have sperm and eggs, which is amazing to think of. That's how they produce. They are like quite similar to animals or some of the species that we've looked at. Very good. I don't know how many different species there are in the Pacific Northwest of seaweed in general. It's 10 for the washcloth, but just flipping through this guide, there are hundreds. And they're really hard to identify. So hopefully this is the Turkish washcloth because, well, there is the Turkish towel, and that one is just so much bigger. And these, I'll repeat again, these do not grow anywhere near Turkey. It's just because of how they feel. So if you go out into the intertidal zone, you might find these. They go up to a depth of 250 meters, but usually you'll find these attached to rocks in these clumps, just sort of a clump of those stems and lamina. And so when you do find them, if you feel them, then you'll know that it's the Turkish washcloth because it's so rough there. And I think they do use them in spas. Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions before we finish up today? I know it was a bit of a quick session. And for Becky, what you said, so this t-shirt is a t-shirt that we sell here when we're open to the public. And this t-shirt is a picture of that gray whale. So the gray whale that maybe some of you, and I know that Becky, you have seen at the station, is that big gray whale that's hanging, the juvenile gray whale that's hanging its skeleton in our station. So that's what these are. Well, thank you all for coming. If you have any more questions, please just put them into the comment section. It was fantastic speaking with you today. Again, sorry, it's a bit of a shorter session than usual. We are just a little bit hectic here. So thank you so much for joining us, and I will see you next week. Bye. Thank you.